thank you everyone for coming along and joining us in this week's WISERD Lunchtime seminar. For those who don't know me, my name's Sam Jones and I work with Scott Orford and Katie Dickson and Sam Morgan as part of the WISERD data team, which sits in the WISERD Hub at Cardiff University. And as the title that you can see in front of you on the slide suggests, this afternoon Katie, Scott and I are going to be sharing some of the work that we've been doing on spatial interrelationships of places in Wales, which involves examining the extent to which different places are dependent on each other for different types of assets. And this builds on some of the work that we've been doing as part of the Understanding Welsh Places project, which we'll say a little bit about a little bit later in the presentation. And it's still very much a work in progress. So we'd appreciate any feedback that you may have at what is a relatively early stage in this work. So I'll just start the presentation by giving you a bit of background to the project. And then Katie's going to talk you through some of the data that we've used. And then we'll have a look at some of the methods in creating the classification, the typology that we've created. And then Scott's going to take us through some of the analysis that we've done using that classification, that typology, to investigate these relationships of place dependency. So we'll just move on by giving you a little bit of background to the work. Thank you, Katie. So as I mentioned, we're looking at the extent to which places in Wales are dependent on each other for different types of assets. And when we use the term assets, we're really referring to any of the main entities that people rely on to undertake routine tasks in their local areas. So that might be schools or doctor surgeries, places of work, shops, green space. All those things would be considered assets of a place in the definition that we're using here. The idea behind this work was really brought about by the rules that the Welsh Government imposed during the coronavirus pandemic, which forced people to stay local. So as a result, there was some anecdotal evidence that suggested that many people lost access to a number of the assets that they were relying on regularly. So the loss of access became particularly apparent during Wales's local lockdowns. I can't remember when, but sometime last spring was it. So many services and businesses that were still open, like hairdressers, gyms, shops, etc. They were still open at that time, or they'd been reopened by that time. But people were prohibited from leaving their local authority that they resided in, which restricted access to some of these assets. So, for instance, there were stories of people from my local area, which is in Bridgend, who suddenly found that they had to travel much further to access assets, such as shops and public services within their own local authority. So within Bridgend or within the Vale, particularly in somewhere like Ogmore, which is on the border of the Vale. So they had to travel a lot further to access assets than they normally would because they couldn't cross the local authority boundary to access their nearest ones. So it became apparent during the pandemic that people regularly rely on a number of assets outside of their local area, particularly their local authority areas in the case of the pandemic, to undertake tasks that are sort of routine and mundane, but nonetheless important and necessary for their own being, for their daily lives. So it caused us to really think about how these assets are shared between places under normal circumstances, so outside of the pandemic restrictions. So for instance, are places in Wales generally self-sufficient? Do they have enough assets to cater for the needs of their local population? Or are neighbouring places dependent on each other for different types of assets? And if they are dependent on one another, what sort of assets are associated with this dependency? And does this vary across Wales? Are places in certain parts of Wales more likely to be dependent on one another than in other parts of Wales? And this might prove important because if places share assets, that has implications on funding and the allocation of local resources between local authority areas or towns or other areas of place. And that obviously then has implications that may vary across Wales depending on the area and depending on the type of asset. So that's really a bit of a background to the work. That's where we were coming from with our thinking about the work. So based on that, we came up with the following aim and objectives. Thank you, Katie. So initially, main aim of this research was to develop a set of metrics which can be used to classify towns and cities based on how dependent they are across a common set of these assets, so public assets in the public sector, commercial assets, social assets. So in trying to achieve this and trying to come up with these metrics to produce this classification, we had the following objectives. So we had to identify metrics that would be used to better understand the availability of these assets. We then had to develop a classification for places in Wales using these metrics to classify places based on their relationship with other places, so the number of these assets in each place, basically. And then this became our interrelationship classification, which tries to describe how dependent one place is on another. And then we did some work to investigate, to actually analyse the places in Wales based on this classification, to investigate the spatial interrelationships between places in Wales, using the classification that we developed using these metrics of assets of place. So as I said, this is still very much a work in progress, but Katie's going to give you a little bit of detail about what we've done so far as part of the Understanding Welsh Places project, and then also talk you through some of the data that we've used to create these metrics. So over to you, Katie. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Hi, everyone. So the first two of these objectives were achieved as part of a wider project called Understanding Welsh Places, where we worked with the Centre of Local Economic Strategies, who have done a lot of research into place dependency over the last 10 years or so. This has been presented to colleagues in WISERD quite recently, so I won't say too much about it, but just for anyone who couldn't make the presentation a few months ago, the Understanding Welsh Places project involved the development of a web application aimed at the third sector, including local community groups and town councils. These groups are often experts in their place, but are not experts in finding or using data. So this application is intended to remove this barrier by collating data and statistical information about places in Wales and making it easier to access and understand. As I said, it's a web application and it's available at understandingwelshplaces.wales for anyone who might be interested in looking at it. But I'll just give you a quick flavour of some of the sort of data it holds as a reminder. So for each place in the UWP, it has its own data dashboard, as well as providing access to the community assets data, which we'll come to. It also allows users to map population flows, so that's commuting, migration and daily trips, graph socioeconomic and demographic data, and compare between places. So this is the dashboard for Aberystwyth, but if I wanted to pull data from Cardiff and do a comparison, I could do so if I wished. Before we go into the community assets data and the development of the classification, I just thought I'd mention how we define places as part of the Understanding Welsh Places project. So as part of UWP, we're defining places as contiguous built-up areas, so CBUAs, which are a combination of the Office of National Statistics 2011 built-up areas dataset and the built-up areas with subdivisions dataset. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, the built-up areas boundaries are delineated by merging together 50-metre square grid cells, which are identified as using predominantly urban land use based on the Ordnance Survey topography layer. As CBUAs are government boundaries, this makes it relatively straightforward to make use of a wide range of government data, such as the census data, which can be assembled from smaller geographies using lookups. The Welsh Government, which is another partner on the project, requested that we only use CBUAs with a residential population of greater than or equal to 2,000. Just to enable more robust statistical analysis. So as a result, we have 193 places in Wales in total. So in terms of developing our interrelationships classification of a place, we first needed to create a set of metrics to measure the numbers of assets in a place. Our choice of assets were based on the advice of CLES, so they undertook a similar exercise in Scotland as part of the Understanding Scottish Places web application, We also looked at the availability of nationally consistent data for Wales, so we had to be pragmatic about what we could actually include. And then we had feedback from user groups. So in 2020, we updated the metrics we've included based on feedback from users of the site. So based on the advice of CLES, the indicators were chosen to portray three things. Firstly, the number of assets in a place compared to the local population. Second, the diversity of a place's business or employment base. And finally, the distance residents have to travel to work or services. The assets we currently include are shown in this table and split over the social, commercial, and public sectors, and includes, for instance, diversity of retail offer, diversity of jobs, and a number of hospitals. So Sam's now going to say something about how we use these assets.
That's great. Thank you very much, Katie. So once we'd identified our assets and used them to develop our classification, we then used them to develop the classification. So I'll just talk you through a little bit how we did that. So again, this is done based on CLES's previous work, exploring how reliant one place is on another, which they've already done it in Scotland as part of Understanding Scottish Places. But the method we used here is very similar to what they used. So we've calculated the number of assets per head of population in each place, so for where appropriate, per head of population where appropriate. So for instance, number of school places per head. We then ranked each place based on each metric and split the ranks into sevenths. And then each seventh is given a score. And then once all the places have been ranked and scored, these scores are aggregated up into a total score for each place. And these total score can then be split up into the 7 categories of place dependence. So places with the highest scores are seen as the more independent places, and places with the lowest scores are seen as the more dependent places, so places that depend on other places for assets. And the map you can see in front of you shows the final distribution of the classification of 193 places. And just from the visual, you might notice that places located far from other places, such as those in Mid Wales, tend to be more independent, so they have enough assets per head of the things that we've measured. Whereas those more clustered together, particularly in South East Wales, such as in the valleys, tend to be more interdependent and dependent. And as I mentioned at the start, so far we've only really focused on the first 2 objectives in our aims, which involved collating the data, identifying the metrics, and then developing this initial classification. But we have done some initial analysis, which Scott's now going to talk us through. So thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so this is really the first sort of dig into the data. So as Sam said, on the website, we have a classification of 7 different types of interdependencies. For the analysis, because the 7 can lead to quite small samples within each of the classifications, we collapsed them initially into 3. So independent, interdependent, and dependent. So what we did first of all is basically created some tables, and we're looking at the differences in interdependence by type of authority, rural, urban, and valley. So if you look at the split, the first thing you can see is that only about 1/5 of places across Wales are independent, making them relatively self-sufficient, and 1/4 are dependent, suggesting that they are reliant on other places for a lot of their assets, and the remainder are interdependent, suggesting that they're independent on some of the assets, but they're reliant on other places for other services. We broke this down by a very basic classification of unitary authority, rural, urban, and valley, which is a classification which the Welsh Government uses. And we can see that from this breakdown straight away that the valleys are quite different from the other 2 classifications and the whole of Wales. In particular, the valleys tend to have a lot more places which are dependent and interdependent rather than independent compared to the rest of Wales. This might not be surprising given that the valleys is the old industrial mining area, and often locations of deep and persistent deprivation. So for the remainder of the analysis, we decided to actually focus on the valleys in a bit more detail. Next slide. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to make sure was that dependency wasn't just a reflection of settlement size. So it could be, we didn't want it to be the case that the bigger settlements tend to be more independent simply because they have more assets, because they've got a bigger population to serve. So what we've done is we've used the Welsh Government's classification of settlements to classify the 193 places in our sample based on their population. And this is the classification we've used extensively on the website. And then we've broken down, so this is how the population breaks down by settlement size. Obviously, rural areas have smaller settlements and urban areas have the large settlements. The valleys, if you know the valleys, they fall somewhere in between. And so it's not the case that the valleys have particularly small settlements or very large settlements. They have quite a variety of them. So suggesting that the high level of dependency isn't just a reflection of settlement size. So next slide, please, Sam. So what we did was we drilled into a bit more. So this is a graph which shows each of the different types of local authority broken down by each of the settlement sizes, and the different colours are the 3 different categories. So we're looking at 3 different classifications in this graph: settlement size, type of local authority, and our dependency classification. So we're looking at all 3 at once. And if you look at the valleys, takes a bit of looking at, but what you can see is that the valleys places tend to be less independent and more dependent than other places across all the town sizes. So it isn't just a function of town size, settlement size. There is something else going on here to do with the type of local authority it's in. So this suggests that the composition of towns and valleys, along with relationships between towns, could be quite different to those seen in other parts of Wales. Next slide, Sam. So like I said, so we focused in on the South Wales valleys for this part of the analysis. And what we did first of all is we looked to see if there's any spatial clustering of places with similar dependency classification. So is it the case that all the dependent places are next to each other, or is it the case that the dependent places are next to the independent places? So we can calculate a statistic here called a local moran. It's just a spatial clustering statistic. And it comes up with a classification of places of whether or not places of similar dependency score are near each other. And then we can then sort of map the data. So what we found was that over half the places, 57%, don't show any sort of significant spatial clustering. So it's not the case that places with a high level of dependence are close to other places of high level of dependence. However, there does seem to be spatial clustering in the valleys. So again, the valleys looks like it's different from other places in Wales. And the majority of spatial clustering does appear to occur in the Welsh valleys. So focusing on the valleys, nearly all the places are either categorised as being dependent places close to other dependent places, or independent places close to dependent places. So this is what when we thought about it, this is what we expect, that dependent places are dependent on each other for their goods and services. So one dependent place might provide goods and services for a dependent place next door, and may supply particular goods and services for the other dependent place. So what you have is clusters of dependent places with people travelling between them to get their goods and services. Independent places, so places which are sort of self-reliant, display a lower degree of spatial clustering with other dependent places. So independent places tend to be further away from each other, but they tend to be close to dependent places. So what we've got here is 2 types of spatial relationship. Independent places are close to each other, but they're also close to independent places as well. Next slide, Sam. So at the moment, this is just looking at spatial patterns. And what we want to do actually is to look at flows of people between places. So part of our data is this city logic data, which is mobile phone data. So we have ideas of how people move between places every day. And again, this data is available on the website. So what we looked at is we looked at the flows of data recorded by samples of mobile devices between May and June 2015. So it's obviously way before the pandemic. And we calculated expected versus model flows. So generally speaking, so this is quite a basic way of looking at it, but it does actually flag up some interesting patterns. So again, we've got this sort of graph where the different colours, the three different colours are the three different dependency types. And then for each of the different local authority areas, we've got expected against what would expect if people were just moving randomly between places, between what's been modelled. And what we've shown is the proportion of trips involving independent and independent towns is often more than we would expect. A proportion of trips between dependent towns is less, suggesting the importance of the independent, interdependent towns on each other. And this trend also holds true for the valleys. We need to sort of combine this with the spatial clustering data, the spatial clustering analysis. We haven't actually managed to do that yet. Next slide, Sam. And what we are going to do, trying to do it, is this. So we look at individual places. So we look at a place which is maybe independent in the valleys, and using the city logic data, but also using commuting data and migration data from the census, which is also on the site. We're actually looking at actual flows of people between those between the independent place and the other places around, to actually get a real feel for how people are moving towards into that place and out of that place. And importantly, in terms of the lockdown, how many people were crossing a local authority boundaries. And as we know in the valleys, there's a high density of local authorities there. And so the incidence of having to rely on another town in a different local authority is probably higher than in other parts of Wales. So what we're beginning to do is to actually look at how Welsh Valley towns are dependent on each other, but in different local authority areas. And of course, this also have repercussions for local authority funding, for instance. Next slide, Sam. Okay. So this initial investigation into interrelationships between places in Wales has identified the Welsh Valleys as a part of Wales where places are more reliant on their neighbouring places for supplying community assets compared to other parts of Wales. This could have important implications for the resilience of these places in terms of their ability to withstand shocks, such as COVID-19 or the economic impacts of Brexit. It also has important implications for supply and demand for funding of local services, as people are not necessarily using assets in the place they live, or even in the same local authority that they live. The implications of this are particularly important in cases where people have to travel across local authority boundaries to access assets, as well as implications for transport planning, such as the development of the South Wales Metro. For the future work, as I said, this is the initial dive into the data. We're going to further investigate the spatial relationships between towns in Wales by looking at the micro level data, the flow data, including analysing the city logic data flows. Our future work will also consider turning the interrelation classification, fine-tuning the interrelations classifications. At the moment, we've collapsed 7 categories into 3. And there's a feeling we've got that maybe 3 classifications are hiding some patterns and nuances. So we have developed a 5 classification scheme. And we can just reproduce the data there, just to see if there's some nuances and some patterns which are being hidden by collapsing 7 categories into 3, particularly in the interdependence category in the middle, which we think is probably quite an important category. But at the moment, we think it's hiding some stuff, some interesting relationships, simply because we've combined lots of places together. And so we're looking at ways we can split this middle interdependence category into maybe 2 or 3 smaller categories to try and unpick that. We also want to consider the impact of cross-border flows. So at the moment, Understanding Welsh Places, we've only ever looked at assets within Wales. And we know that the Welsh border is very porous in terms of flows of people and accessing goods and services on towns in England. And we also know that during the lockdown, it was very difficult to actually cross the border, or illegal to cross the border in some cases. So for UWP3, or the sort of next phase of Understanding Welsh Places, we are hoping to do a lot more work on cross-border flows, but that would involve working with local authorities on the English border. So it's something we need to sort of discuss with our funders. So that's really the where we've got so far with analysing the data. We've recently just done some work creating travel time metrics from each place. So we know how easy it is to get from one place to another. So as the previous map showed, we've just simply linked the places using straight line distances in the valleys, and we know that's a big no-no. Knowing how the topology of the valleys, that you can't just simply go from one to another, it's not that easy. So we are calculating travel time as a way of weighting our spatial weights in our statistics. We're also looking at public transport as well with Gary Higgs. So there's a lot more to do, but this was just an initial deep dive into the data. Next slide, Sam. So yeah, it's just a sort of a thank you and any sort of feedback and questions you've got at this point. So I'll open it up to questions. So either in the chat or put your hand up or just shout out. There's a hand up, I'm trying to find who that is. Martin, yes. Hi, Martin.
Scott, how you doing? Right. Scott, I wondered if you could make a connection, if you could. You know, the area paper that you published in 1998 that analysed the policy transcripts and had the idea of spatial fields by policy. I wonder if there's a connection between the argument you're making today and the arguments you tried to make in there. I think there's a really important argument you've got. That's I think what you've got is a place-based critique of notions of places and spaces made relationally as being open-ended and flow. So I think your empirical data actually has some really important conceptual theoretical points behind it that are worth pushing. And I think there's a relationship between what your data shows in Wales in terms of different geographies of territorial placemaking that's worth pushing, I think, in terms of whether it's related to social relations and the relationship between social relations and the service geographies that you highlight. Set against those debates that are in the social sciences for the last 20 years about places being completely unbounded, because what you empirically demonstrate is a distinctive geography of placemaking. The reason why that geography of placemaking then becomes a kind of question you might want to explore. But kind of your throwaway comment that's actually more kind of pertinent in the data is the relatively bounded nature, the bounded nature and the kind of and the dependent nature of places in the valleys, and they are more kind of territorially bound than those literatures suggest. And I think probably for the first time I've seen actual country level data that you've got that actually can really highlight. So I think there's encouragement that because I really like that paper that you published in 1998, wasn't it, with that one you did with Webb on that paper? Yeah.
Yeah, it was 2019.
2019,
based on the localities data. So
I know, yeah, I was going to say. Anyway, I think there's a connection here to that new localities argument from WISERD 1.
Yeah.
So in a sense, I think there's something deeply, to get to the point, that's more of a comment than a question. I think there's a really sophisticated theoretical argument that you might want to pull off.
Yeah,
Credit to you. I think it's really fascinating. I think it's a quality, high quality data that's worth pushing against those. And those debates are still alive. You kind of see them cutting around debates around assemblage thinking, don't you?
Yeah.
Credit to you.
Yeah, this is why we've sort of pulled publishing stuff, because we need to get there's more than one paper here actually. There is definitely a theoretical paper. We're trying to capture that flow better by using like the city logic data, but also looking at using the travel time data and things like that. So it's proper topology. Because a lot of the spatial weights empirically, they just use quite naive spatial weights that doesn't model how people traverse the environment, particularly in the valleys, which is why we're looking at drive time and also public transport use, as well as going into the empirical weights, spatial weights, to actually give it some robustness. But you're right, it does feed into the idea of relational spaces.
And then added to that, Scott, I think you basically do a contemporary reading of what geographers used to call time geography. So I think you do a time geography critique of topology. That's another one to think about. I think, because that's empirically what you do. If you think of that Haggerstrand early 1970s, order, the problem with those literatures is no one can empirically demonstrate them. You've got the if you think about it, so this is kind of. And that is about those, even kind of John Allen's recent work of like the kind of 2018 book on topology being this kind of this open-ended it's aspatial more than anything else. So
that's always been my issue with it. It's sort of an ontological flattening of space, and people tend to be able to move smoothly across space in relational space. When actually they can't, and particularly in the valleys. I think the reason the valleys has come out simply because they are constrained by the physical nature of the valleys, and that's been the idea of the sort of topography has been replaced by ideas of topology, and actually you need both.
And the last question, and I think this is the most interesting thing I'll do today, so credit to you, Scott. The last one is, I think you're talking about the importance of the reappearance of location, because what you show is place into dependency and what Eric Shepherd calls positionality. So I think there's a subtle argument around positionality and location, and that location I think is as much topographical as it is topological. This is that point you last made. So I think this is just really there's at least 4 papers or kind of in this. It's kind of how you want to cut the data, but it's just really high quality stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean the point is this is part of the cross-sectional package of WISERD, so we're very happy to work with other people in WISERD. So if you want to, if you've got some really good theoretical grounding, we can provide the empirical evidence. We could write joint papers on it, and that's the whole point of this.
I'll pick it. I'll email you in this, but thank you.
Yeah, that'd be really good. Okay, Sally.
Hey, thanks very much, Scott, Sam, and Katie. Absolutely fascinating. I love a good map. This is just a very a kind of factual question. You talk about the stuff done in Scotland. Is there any interesting differences between the profile of dependency in Wales and Scotland? I mean, is it the valleys, or is actually the distribution fairly similar, or have you not looked at that yet?
We've not really looked at it yet, simply because we'd have to request the raw data.
Right.
I'm not quite sure how up to date the Scottish data is as well. There's been a bit of a divergence between the two projects, but yes, there could be some.
Fascinating.
The data is similar enough for them to apply the methods and the ideas. So there could be a collaborative paper with Scotland and Wales, because we have used the same metrics. We have got the same data deliberately, because it was the same. Claes was the consultant there, so we've basically just not copied, but we've reproduced what they've done when it was relevant. So yes, there's potentially a paper comparing it to Scotland, and yes, it'd be interesting because I suspect the boundaries are less porous in Scotland than there is in Wales, in some ways, because it's bigger, population's bigger. Although you might find there's be interesting to see what parts of Scotland are similar to what parts of Wales do that. So yeah, we do have contacts in Scotland who are working on understanding Scottish places, and we can contact them, I suppose, after we've done the Welsh research for some collaborative. Yeah, it's good ideas, Sally.
Thanks.
Paul? Microphone, Paul?
Sorry about that. Thanks,
Okay.
Scott, Sam, and Katie. That was great, really interesting. Just a quick question, sort of impact and engagement wise. The Welsh Local Government Act this year, as you know, puts in duties on Welsh local authorities to work together. I was just wondering your thoughts, initial thoughts. I know it's early days on how you might use your data on interdependency to help them fulfil that duty of working together.
Yeah, so well, part of the Understanding Welsh Places was actually to demonstrate that at a town level, that a town that you're sort of that you may have to look beyond your local authority to other towns which are similar to you. So the town next door doesn't, because so a neighbouring town doesn't mean it's similar to you in terms of its demographics or in terms of its issues. And quite a lot of times towns look at neighbours to see what they're doing, and actually they need to be looking elsewhere. And so partly what the website does is it actually bundles together similar towns based upon interdependencies. So you might find it's a local authority elsewhere, not just your neighbouring local authority, which you need to look at in terms of policy. But in terms of sharing assets, then actually, obviously, distance becomes important. And in a place like a Welsh Valley, you could differentiate between your neighbouring local authorities depending on your assets, particularly the big assets. I think interesting ones would be things like schools, actually. That's come out as quite interesting. And GP services, particularly NHS and NHS dentists. So there could be an opportunity for them to sort of use the website and use the research to actually look at how assets are being shared at a service level between the different local authorities. Particularly if you link it then to public transport, which we're trying to do. That will make it really powerful then if you link asset availability to public transport across different local authority areas, then I think that becomes a very useful tool.
Great,
so
thanks, Scott.
Working with Gary Higgs and his RA on that, because they're doing a lot of work on that. So it's just about joining up some of the research and WISERD a bit. Like I said, if this sparked any ideas, please contact us, because we've got all this data. We can't analyze it all, or and we're all looking for inspiration as well. And we've got some capacity in the WISERD cross-cutting package to do some work, and to do some joint work. And I think we have got access to some really good data now that we can do some really interesting stuff. And some of this will be updated next year when the census comes out again. So there'll be a refresh, particularly on some of the commuting data, although that will be a slightly biased with the working at home, and the migration data. Okay, I think we'll come to an end then. So thanks for joining us. Just email me or Sam or Katie if you've got any other questions, or actually any sort of ideas for research. And Martin, give us a shout, and give us an email, and we'll sort of catch up offline.